Baseball in Japan has things that in America you will never see. They have managers of the team being introduced on hovercrafts, teams' star players being ziplined through the stadium hundreds of feet in the air before games, and even ceremonial first pitches where players kiss the person throwing the pitch, and even sometimes their own teammates. Based on this, it's somewhat hard to believe that Japanese baseball culture is one of the most cutthroat in the world, creating some of the most disciplined athletes on earth, a system where high school coaches can make over $200,000 a year. At some schools, kids are expected to practice 8 hours a day. High school tournaments are so important, players play through career-threatening injuries, and after losing are expected to cry. Students go through months and months of intense training like this, and these aren't even baseball players. This is the cheering section. They are training to cheer for the baseball team, who practices even harder. According to Ichiro, the training regimen he was put through as a child was so intense, he only had 5 to 6 hours to hang out with friends in an entire year. The most pitches thrown by a pitcher in MLB last season was 117. At an elite high school in Japan, pitchers were expected to throw 200 pitches every other day. Life around baseball is so strict and regimented, even professionals are expected to live in team dormitories full-time, where in some past cases, players who break curfew were even beaten by their own managers, a practice that became so common throughout all levels of baseball in Japan that in 2021, the Human Rights Watch organization had to release a report just to address it. But despite this insane dedication, only a few decades ago, an American team went to Japan and beat a team of Japanese all-stars so badly, a Japanese player said himself, quote, "We can never challenge the Americans. We're a team of little leaguers playing adults." Today, that is no longer the case. In the past year, Japan went undefeated in the World Baseball Classic, winning it for the 3rd time. No other country has won it more than once, all while getting viewership that baseball in America can't come close to. A Japanese player just became the highest paid baseball player in history. A few weeks later, another Japanese player became the highest paid pitcher in history. And in total, MLB teams have signed 6 Japanese players this offseason alone for a combined $1.13 billion. All of a sudden, Japan is taking over a sport that America has claimed for over a century, all while using training methods that many people in America might call child abuse. But this quote-unquote abuse also results in a level of honor and respect on the field that you won't see anywhere else in the world. Like when this catcher lost his contact in the middle of a play. Instead of keeping the game going, the entire team and even the umpires helped him look for it in the dirt. Japanese baseball culture can seem like a paradox. On one hand, it's extremely regimented, traditional, and even militaristic. Other aspects of it are the complete opposite, like the ceremonial first pitches. Perhaps the most infamous is the Bay Stars, who have a tradition where they invite an improv group called the Ostrich Club. The group does this dressed as gangsters, as women, as babies, or themselves. Traditionally in Japan, a member of the team goes to the plate and swings and misses at the first pitch. But when the Ostrich Club throws it, the player always makes contact, causing a fight between the pitcher and the batter, which always ends in the two kissing each other. It's hard to imagine this ever happening in America, or even this. This is former major leaguer Tsuyoshi Shinjo, who was hired as a manager in Japan, where he had the league officially change his name to Big Boss. A former fashion designer, he created multiple custom uniforms to fit his style. He makes grand entrances on cars, has his own theme song, and notoriously entered 2022 opening day on a hovercraft, rode it around the stadium for a little, landed it, then managed the game moments later. With the hovercraft, strange mascot fights, cheerleaders, and bizarre skits can be deceiving because baseball in Japan is taken extremely seriously, and it's been that way for over a century. When baseball was introduced in Japan in the 1800s, the word sport didn't even exist in Japanese. The closest thing they had were things like sumo wrestling, kendo, horseback riding, which were all extensions of military training. So unlike in America, the people who played were essentially treated as soldiers. Early baseball managers like Suishu Tobido said, quote, "If players do not try as hard as to vomit blood during practice, then they cannot hope to win games." He created a system called Shi no Renshu, which when translated to English means death practice, and had players field ground balls until they were, quote, half dead, motionless, and had froth coming from their mouths. In early versions of baseball in Japan, if you got smoked by a pitch but tried to get out of the way, you didn't get to go to first because you lacked the courage to get hit by a pitch. According to Tobida's philosophy, if players don't cry after losing a game, it means they don't care enough, which is why in Japan, you will regularly see losing players bawling their eyes out after losing, because baseball is less about having fun and more about teaching discipline, self-sacrifice, dedication, and having the fighting spirit, which results in things that to Americans seem absolutely insane. Like just last year, when an elite baseball school in Japan beat another school, which got 5 of their players from the school's music club 82-0. They hit 17 home runs and stole 36 bases. Yes, they stole the entire game, even stealing multiple times when winning 82-0. They scored so much, it took 3 hours and 13 minutes to play 5 innings. The losing team was in the field so long, a player literally had a heat stroke in the middle of the game. They had no substitutions, meaning him exiting would result in a forfeit. So despite being down over 50 runs and having an actual heat stroke, he and the team decided he must tough it out to avoid a forfeit. The team would end up forfeiting in the 5th, but even while losing by 82 runs, they had their pitcher throw 225 pitches. Major league teams will rarely let their pitchers throw over 100 pitches in a game to protect their arms. This high school student threw 225 in an 82-run blowout. If this happened in America, both these coaches would have been fired. But in Japan, both teams trying their hardest, despite the extreme skill gap, is the ultimate form of respect. The losing coach said, quote, "It was just a blessing the players were able to play with smiles on their faces." And the comments on the video in Japanese seem positive, with people congratulating both teams on fighting to the end and giving it their all. In Japanese baseball, losing this badly is suffering, and suffering without quitting should be celebrated. And this philosophy goes back well over a century. In the early 1900s, Japan's most popular team had a motto that urged players to practice until they urinated blood. Students would start training at 4 a.m., and the coach believed a team needed 2 to 3 years of practice before they were ready to play their first game. Their methods, heavily influenced by samurai teaching, still influence youth baseball today. It's normal for Little League teams to train 10 hours a day every single Saturday and Sunday. According to one account from an American kid who moved to Japan, his coach would take the team to lunch, then immediately put them through an intense drill that would only end once a certain amount of players threw up their lunch. And in a famous case in 1986, an 11-year-old boy died because practice was that hard. His coach had their team do 20 160-yard dashes, a 2-mile run, another running drill where players ran full speed for several minutes trying to catch a ball tossed in the air, followed by a fielding session of 100 ground balls. Players were not allowed to drink water during this, and this was their pre-game warm-up. The team ended up losing, so the manager ordered a post-game workout with 10 30-yard dashes, 10 60-yard dashes, 10 laps around the field, 10 sprints up and down the stadium stairs, and 3 60-yard dashes to wrap it up. In all, they ran an estimated 10 miles. These kids were 11 years old, and one of them tragically passed away shortly after. But taking these extreme examples and dismissing Japanese training philosophies altogether ignores the massive amounts of success that it's brought them. And to see that, all you have to do is watch this. This is a high school baseball tournament called the Summer Koshin that is so important, the Hanshin Tigers, a professional baseball team, is forced to leave their home stadium for 2 weeks just so they can play it. During those 2 weeks, an insane 500,000 people come to see this tournament live. In terms of viewership, high school baseball might be the most popular sport in Japan. In fact, the Summer Koshin has the same per capita viewership as the Super Bowl does in America. To get to this tournament, players dedicate everything, like this kid who dislocated his shoulder, went to the dugout in agony, had his manager pop his shoulder back into place, and even while in extreme pain, ran onto the field to play. Players dedicate everything just for a chance to play in this tournament. Most teams force their players to shave their heads. Elite schools eat, sleep, and live with their team year-round. In America, the NCAA only allows college athletes to practice 4 hours a day. In Japan, it's not uncommon for high school teams to practice 7 hours a day, as well as 12-hour practices on holidays. At elite schools, teams often have over 100 players on a team, while only 20 of them are allowed to be in the dugout, meaning most players go through this extreme training schedule for all 3 years of high school. And even if their team makes it to the Koshin, they just have to watch from the stands. But this is still considered an extreme honor because making it is almost impossible. It is a single elimination tournament, meaning it's essentially a March Madness style bracket with over 4,000 teams. A single loss ruins their dreams, which is why it's normal to see things like this. This player got destroyed and needed a stretcher. He refused the stretcher and came back 2 minutes later. This player got smoked in the head, was carted off the field, but refused to leave the game and still played. And this catcher got nailed in the face with a ball so hard he knocked out multiple teeth, stayed in the game, and hit a double a few hours later. To really understand how dedicated these players and schools are about this tournament, all you have to do is look at their cheering sections. They have cheer teams made up of the school's students. These teams practice throughout the year and go through intense training, just like the players do, in order to cheer better and help their school go further in the tournament. And just like the players, when they mess up, there are consequences.
声がね、もう口パクなんよお前ら思ってるんで期待しています。
They do coordinated and rehearsed chants throughout the game. Some take it so seriously that they will actually continue to cheer in the rain even when the game is in a rain delay. When a team loses, it is a sign of respect for a cheer team to conduct their final cheer at the opposing team to show their gratitude before ending their season. And just like the players, losing in this tournament is an extremely tragic event. It is normal and pretty much expected for players and cheer members to cry when losing, and given how much training and sacrifice is required to get there, this is understandable. But some losses are harder than others. Perhaps the hardest happened in 1971. Okayado High School made it to the Koshin and were traveling to the tournament when news broke that a fight between two students at the school left one of the students hospitalized. Even though neither of these students were on the baseball team and no one on the team had anything to do with it, the school decided that since such an ugly incident happened at their school, it would be shameful to have their baseball team represent them at such an honorable tournament. they withdrew the team from the tournament and had them turn around while they were already on their way, ending their dreams even though they did nothing wrong. Punishment has always been a massive part of high school baseball in Japan, and strict coaching is what made their high school baseball teams the most disciplined, respectful, and talented in the world. But when taken to extremes, it can be extremely abusive. Incidents like this, which surfaced in 2018, show a coach repeatedly kicking, slapping, and punching multiple members on the team. This was apparently punishment for their players not leaving their phones at home when they went to class. Historically, things like this were not uncommon. Leading up to the 2021 Olympics in Tokyo, the Human Rights Watch organization released a 57-page report on child abuse in sports in Japan. In it were accounts of baseball players being hit in the face by their coaches until they bled from their faces, managers kicking players, throwing baseballs at players, and hitting them with bats. Many are calling on teams in Japan to shorten practices, stop corporal punishments, and make youth baseball less militaristic. In some ways it has. For example, last year's Koshin winner won it while having long hair. They were one of at least 7 teams in the tournament that did not require their players to shave their heads, which has been a universal practice forever. At least 4 schools were suspended from high school play in 2023 because coaches were physically abusive while punishing players. On one hand, it shows they're cracking down on abuse, but it also shows it's still happening. This video, which surfaced recently, shows a coach dragging a player to the ground in a classroom. He was eventually fired for this, which is a sign of progress of a problem that without a doubt used to be a lot worse. In 1987, a similar incident happened when a coach hit multiple players in the head with the butt of a baseball bat, leaving them bleeding from their scalp. Not only was he not fired and only got a 1-year suspension, one of the players who got hit in the head said, quote, "I don't blame the manager. It was our fault." At the most elite schools, high school coaches can make up to $200,000+ a year. At some schools, they control all aspects of players' lives, including when they eat, what they eat, when they sleep, and how much they practice. For pitchers, this can mean throwing up to 300 pitches a day. In America, this may be considered more abusive than hitting a player. The state of California has a law that bans pitchers from throwing over 110 pitches in a week. In 2013, this pitcher threw 318 pitches in 2 days. He won both these games, sending his team to the Koshin, where he had so much arm pain he was given a painkiller injection. When that didn't work, he was given stimulants. He labored through the first game and won. In the second round, the pain was even worse. His velocity was only reaching 57 miles per hour, but he refused to quit and in obvious pain lobbed ball after ball over the plate. He struck out the only batter he faced and then was taken out of the game. The next year, he was only able to pitch in 2 games. He ended up going to college, where in his first 3 seasons, he wasn't able to make a single appearance due to injury. This painful video is used as an example to criticize coaches who put their young pitcher's future at risk for success at the Koshin. But years later, the pitcher puts zero blame on the coach, saying that it was his decision, and at the time he thought, quote, "I don't care about my future. Even if I can't compete in the future, I just want to play in the Koshin." This is a common mindset surrounding the tournament and has created legends in Japan. Yusei Kikuchi, who has gone on to have a major league career, first became a celebrity when he was 17 in the Koshin when he pitched despite having severe back pain and a broken rib. According to him, he pitched that day thinking it would be the end of his baseball career. Before Daisuke Matsuzaka went to the Red Sox, he pitched a 148-pitch shutout in the round of 16 at the Koshin. This is more pitches than any MLB pitcher has thrown in a game all season. He followed it up by pitching the very next day, where he not only pitched, but pitched a 17-inning complete game where he threw 250 pitches. The next day, he came into the game again, pitched the final inning, and sent his team to the finals, where one day later, he threw a 9-inning no-hitter to win the Koshin. In one of the best pitching performances in baseball history, he threw 500 pitches, 3 complete games, and threw 36 innings in 4 days. This cemented him as a legend and celebrity in Japan at 17 years old. But in terms of pitch count and wear and tear on a pitcher's arm, even that doesn't compare to the famous matchup between Masahiro Tanaka and Yuki Sato. These two met in the 2006 finals. To get there, Yuki Sato threw a complete game in the quarterfinals. The very next day, he threw a complete game in the semifinals. The day after that, he faced Masahiro Tanaka's team in the finals and threw another complete game. But this one was 15 innings long. After 15 innings, the score was tied 1-1. According to the Koshin rules at the time, if a game went longer than 15 innings tied, the game would restart and be replayed the next day from the first inning. And even though Sato, who had just thrown 3 complete games in 3 days, the third one being 15 innings long where he threw 165 pitches, he started the very next day. Tanaka also pitched all 9 innings for his team on 0 days rest, but in the end, in arguably the most legendary moment in Koshin history, in a 4-3 game, Sato struck out Tanaka to get the final out, winning the Koshin. In the end, Tanaka, who was battling the flu, threw 52 innings and 742 pitches in 11 days, while Sato, the undisputed star of the tournament, pitched 7 games in 2 weeks, threw 69 innings in an insane 948 pitches, the most innings and pitches thrown in the 100-plus year history of the Koshin. In 2023, Sandy Alcantara threw 3 complete games all season. That was the most in Major League Baseball. Sato threw 4 of them in 4 days. He became an instant celebrity. While pitching, he would constantly wipe his face with a handkerchief, earning him the nickname the Handkerchief Prince, which became such a popular nickname, it was awarded the New Word Buzzword Award, given to the term that captured the public's attention the most throughout the year. The specific brand of handkerchief at one point were being sold for $3, but due to Sato, they were selling for $70. His opponent, Masahiro Tanaka, went on to become a star in MPB, became a success in MLB for the Yankees, and cemented himself as one of Japan's most elite pitchers. Sato wasn't as successful. He pitched 11 years in MPB, battled shoulder injuries, and put up a career ERA over 4.5. Yet, he remained a household name. According to some, Sato remained in MPB despite bad performances just based on the revenue the team received from merchandise and commercials he shot for the team. Even today, after retirement, he's on TV commercials and has become a commentator. His gutsy performance as a 17-year-old led to notoriety that lasted his entire life. So it's no surprise players will risk their future to pitch in this tournament, even if it seems like child abuse to Americans. In 2013, a pitcher who had a similar performance made headlines in America. Tomohiro Enraku had carried his team to the finals, pitching almost every inning of 5 games in 9 days while nursing fatigue and a hand injury, but in the finals ended up losing 17-1. He lost all of his effectiveness out of nowhere, and despite the blowout, was only removed from the game after his 772nd pitch of the tournament. This made headlines in America. A scout interviewed in One Piece said he was the #1 prospect in Japan, but after the final, his career was in jeopardy. Yu Darvish's agent described the treatment as nothing less than child abuse. Enraku didn't pitch again for months due to injury. He made his professional debut 2 years later, where his fastball was 4 miles per hour slower than it was in high school. He has since battled injuries throughout his young career. It's easy to blame his high pitch count for the injuries and dismiss Japanese pitching methods as dangerous. However, if that was true, you'd expect to see Japanese pitchers getting hurt way more often than American pitchers, which isn't the case. The only research available on this studied an MLB organization and an MPB organization and found MLB players get injured 3.7 times more frequently than players in Japan. The study also found no significant difference in injuries between pitchers in MLB and in MPB. There is real reason to believe that throwing more pitches, even at a young age, builds more endurance and strength and actually protects a pitcher's arm. But even in Japan, this is open for debate. The Koshin just implemented a new rule that bans pitchers from throwing more than 500 pitches in a week in order to protect them. But this is still 2 to 3 times more pitches than any major leaguer would ever throw in a week. The real danger for pitchers isn't necessarily throwing a lot of pitches, it's throwing a lot of pitches while injured, which happens all the time in the Koshin because playing in it too many is a bigger honor than even playing in the pros. But for players who do want to play in the pros, it's just as important because it's the #1 place for amateur players to get scouted and seen. Players like Shohei Ohtani, Ichiro, Daisuke Matsuzaka, Hideki Matsui, Yu Darvish, and many, many more had their careers jump-started at the Koshin, then went on to become Japan's biggest baseball legends. So there's no surprise why high schoolers will play through injuries, live strict regimented lives, go through 7 hours of practice a day, and oftentimes endure actual physical abuse for a chance to play in it and improve their chances of going pro. But once they leave high school and do go to the pros, the training and lifestyle there is shockingly similar. Warren Cromartie described playing professional baseball in Japan as, quote, serving in the Japanese Imperial Army. Charlie Manuel says the coaching was so strict and regimented, his coach was in charge of when he was able to change his socks. For Americans, professional baseball in Japan results in major culture shock. Just ask Rod Allen, who after being targeted by a pitch, charged the mound, but instead of the pitcher defending himself on the mound, ran away. He chased him, dodging multiple people while the pitcher ran across the infield into the outfield, being chased by Rod Allen and dozens of other players. The fight ended without any punches, but Rod Allen was still exhausted. This would probably never happen in America, but the major difference between professional baseball in Japan and the US is that it's probably 3 times more work. The MPB has a long history of famously strict managers. In 1977, Giants manager Tetsuhara Kawakami forbid his players' wives from requesting sex from his players so that they would be able to conserve their energy. The team also banned players from reading comic books in public to protect their image. The Seibu Lions had a rule that banned players from being in commercials. Tetsuo Hiroka once banned his team from drinking soda. He also didn't let his players see their girlfriends during the season because he thought it was a distraction, and put every player on a strict diet of fish, soybeans, brown rice, tofu, and soup. He would even call his players at night to make sure they were in bed by 12 o'clock. After a disappointing season in 1984, he ordered a postseason camp that lasted 3 months. Instead of going home for the offseason, players were required to do 8 hours of drills a day, take 600 swings every day, and pitchers were made to throw 430 pitches a day. When they didn't do baseball, he had his players do other things like swimming and aikido. This was an infamous training camp and not normal even in Japan. However, fall camp like this, but less intense, is a thing that teams still do today. Major leaguers end their season in October, then go home until spring training in February. In Japan, players are expected to report for more practice as soon as the season ends. It typically lasts a month, followed by spring training, which starts on the 1st of February. So many MPB players' off-season is just 1 month. When spring training does start, it is not relaxed like it is in MLB. It's common for MPB pitchers pitchers to do nagekomi sessions, essentially throwing as many pitches as physically possible. In 2014, Takuma Archia threw 341 pitches in one bullpen. It's normal for players to take part in the 1000 fungo drill, a famous drill in Japan where a coach hits ground balls to a fielder until they quit, get sick, pass out, or field 1,000 balls. A young infielder for the Giants passed out doing this in 2014, requiring a cardiac massage from a trainer. Spring training in Japan is about building strength and mental will, like this infielder who was recorded taking swings relentlessly for hours until he was on the brink of exhaustion and his hands were covered in blisters. This would never happen in the US, where spring training usually consists of a few hours of instruction, then players basically left to their own devices to slowly build themselves up for a long season. In Japan, they can go through an intense 7-hour practice followed by hours of studying, all enforced by the organization. Players are so used to this. When American Bobby Valentine was hired to manage a team in Japan and put the team through a more relaxed American-style training camp with less running, less intensity, and more rest, the players literally revolted and held their own secret practices behind the manager's back so they could get more practice in. The players are used to strict regimented lives. Each team has their own dormitories where young players are required to live. They have a dormitory director whose job it is to wake them all up at the same time, make sure they all eat, make sure they're all eating healthy, and even is in charge of making sure they all bathe. Players live in these dormitories throughout the entire season and have to request permission every time they want to leave. They have a strict curfew that, if is broken, results in a fine and in some cases even worse. Like the famous story of Tsuneno Horiyuchi. According to him, he was beaten by his legendary coach Sadahara O in a bathtub because he broke curfew too many times. Most of the players in dormitories are in the organization's minor league team, but many teams require all players to live in dorms for their first several years, no matter how good they are. Meaning there are legitimate stars worth millions in Japan who still live in small dorm rooms, sharing a space with dozens of other minor leaguers. Most players leave the dorms as soon as possible to gain their freedom, but the most dedicated players are known to stay as long as possible. For example, Shohei Ohtani had won league MVP and was already the most famous athlete in Japan while still living in the team dormitory. Ichiro elected to live in the dorms into his 6th season, even though he was league MVP, in order to live closer to the batting cages. In one extreme case, a pitcher named Shigehi Noguchi became the best pitcher in the organization, won an MPB championship, a league MVP, an ERA title, and had a salary of $1 million. He still voluntarily lived in the team dorm all year so he could solely focus on baseball. After his 11th year in the dorm at 28 years old, he finally left after his team strongly recommended it was time to get his own place. It's hard to imagine any star athlete in America living in dormitories, especially by choice, but in Japan, athletes are much less individualistic and are essentially seen as employees of their team. In fact, most players don't even really own their own likeness. If a player gets an endorsement, it has to be organized through their team, who has to approve it and even takes a cut. In the past, some teams have even banned their players from doing commercials because they were seen as a distraction, costing players tens of thousands of dollars. By comparison, MPB players have significantly less rights. In fact, it was illegal for professional baseball players to have their own agents until 2001. Even today, player agents have to be a licensed lawyer and are only allowed to have one baseball client. Since only having one client isn't enough to have a lucrative business, baseball agents in Japan still aren't really a thing. Holding out or even haggling management for larger contracts is frowned upon and looked at as selfish in Japan. Despite this, in the 75-year history of NPB, there has only been one player strike. The fans were so angry and players felt so guilty that during the strike, they still agreed to play games during the weekdays while they were on strike. On days they didn't, they agreed to sign autographs at the stadium for the entire day, and the strike only ended up lasting 2 days. On the complete opposite side of the spectrum, MLB players have been involved in 9 work stoppages, have seen player salaries multiply regularly through negotiations with ownership, have strong-armed the team and league to provide a ton of luxury for players, and have created one of the strongest unions in the world where it's actually considered selfish not to negotiate and do whatever you can to get the biggest contract possible. So based on this individualistic mindset, which is common in America, it's no surprise that when MLB players have come to Japan, they've become some of the most hated players in the country. Just ask Kevin Schreiber, who was targeted and hit by this pitcher 3 times. The 3rd time, he charged the mound. The pitcher ran away all the way into the outfield. Schreiber chased him across the field, caught up to him, tackled him, then was apparently kicked in the face by the opposing manager. Upset about this, Schreiber went back to the dugout, pretended to calm down, then beelined for the manager to get revenge. He pushed the catcher out of the way, but lost his balance and fell on his face, then got kicked in the face by the same manager for the 2nd time. Historically, foreign players haven't necessarily been accepted, and dozens of them have stories and incidents just like this. In MPB, teams are only allowed to have 4 foreign players at a time. In the past, this number was even lower. At times, there was even talk about banning foreign players altogether. These players often get paid more than Japanese players, have agents, aren't used to the demanding practices, and depending on their status, might do their own training regimen away from the team. In the 80s, the commissioner of NPB himself said that foreigners were, quote, overpaid, underproductive, and generally annoying. This was the commissioner of the league. Oftentimes, foreign players have said just as disrespectful things about Japan. Kevin Mitchell came to Japan only to quit 2 months later, saying, quote, "The Japanese are dirty. I really dislike them." This was after he suffered a knee injury, wanted to rest, but the team was insistent that he play through the pain. Probably hoping to return to MLB one day, it's understandable that he didn't want to risk further injury, but in Japan, if you're the highest paid player on the team, it's pretty disrespectful not to do everything you can to get back on the field to help them. Just 7 years earlier, Shoji Murata tore his UCL, an injury that requires Tommy John and takes over a year to heal. Desperate to get back on the mound, he continued to throw 100 or more pitches every single day with a torn UCL. His arm supposedly swelled 2 to 3 times its normal size, but he continued to throw and heal his arm through sheer will. Doctors didn't know what was wrong, trainers didn't help, he tried acupuncture, massages, and even attempted electroshock therapy. He eventually went to a remote island where he practiced Zen meditation, did extended fasts, swam in ice-cold water, tried putting hot wax on his arm to heal it, and even wrapped his arm in snakeskin that had been soaked in whiskey for 8 years, hoping it would suck out the poison. At one point, his arm became so deformed from throwing every day with a torn UCL, his team had to give him a cease and desist letter that forbid him from throwing. Choji was apparently so embarrassed he wasn't able to pitch, he even gave his wife permission to divorce him. But after all of this, Choji met with a doctor who suggested a new procedure called Tommy John surgery. He became the first Japanese player to ever get the surgery, and after 827 days, he returned to the mound. At 63 years old, he could still throw 84 miles per hour. The complete and utter dedication to the team is hard to fathom for MLB players coming to Japan. According to Scott Anderson, in his first year in Japan, he witnessed his manager gather the entire team to watch him slap the team's shortstop in the face until he was red because he made 2 errors. Anderson was shocked. He approached the player, told him he shouldn't let the manager do that, and even offered him to take him to the police station and testify on his behalf. The player responded by saying, quote, "No, it was an honor to have such a great man educate me." To say this is an extreme culture shock is an understatement. Clyde Wright says that after losing 2 straight games in Japan, his team suggested he send his wife back home to America. In one tragic example, Randy Bass, an NPB legend, had to return to his home in Oklahoma in the middle of a season to take care of his son who had a brain tumor. When he did not return to Japan by the agreed upon date, fans questioned his loyalty to the team and he was dropped from the organization. To make matters even worse, the Tigers tasked their GM to try to get Bass to return to the team while negotiating a deal that would prevent the team from having to pay Bass's son's medical bills. When Bass turned this offer down, the general manager felt so stressed from the high expectations and embarrassed for not being able to get Bass back to Japan, he committed suicide. This is an example of how seriously Japanese culture takes the duty of being dedicated to your profession. Putting work in front of family and health is normal and even respected, so for hardcore Japanese fans, players like Bass refusing to make the same sacrifices for the team is extremely disrespectful because it means they're not taking Japanese baseball seriously and are just there to get a check. Japan has always been known as an isolationist country. In fact, in 1981, a study found that 64% of Japanese people didn't want to associate with foreigners. When Leon Lee came to Japan, he was forced to sell his Mercedes because the team banned players from driving foreign cars, and a trade war and rising tensions between the US and Japan in the 80s made things even worse for American players, who often complained that despite their great numbers, it felt like the country and league were actively rooting against them, and in some cases, this was actually true. When Darryl Spencer was about to become the first foreign player to win the Triple Crown, he got walked over 20 times in a row to prevent him from hitting another home run. He even went to the plate with his bat upside down, and they still walked him to prevent him from getting the Triple Crown. For decades, when a foreign player challenged an important record, they would get this treatment. Randy Bass only needed one home run with 2 games left to tie the single-season home run record in Japan. Ironically, these 2 games were against a team managed by Sadaharu Oh, the man who held the record. To prevent Bass from getting a chance to tie the record, pitchers on the team were threatened with $1,000 fines for every strike they threw to Bass. He got walked 6 times in 2 games and never got the record. In 2001, Tuffy Rhodes tied the record with 3 games left to play. He also had to play against a team managed by Sadaharu Oh. They attempted to walk him 4 straight times. Rhodes got mad, swung anyway, grounded out twice, and never broke the record. The next year, Alex Cabrera was 1 homer away from tying the record with 13 games left. According to him, in his last 20 at-bats, he got 1 strike, including a game against Sadaharu Oh's team where he got walked twice and got hit by a pitch, while a Hawks catcher was seen smiling in approval of the walks. He apparently got revenge by running over a catcher while coming home and said after the game that Oh refused to let him break the record. But Sadaharu Oh and others on the team maintain that the team refused to let these players challenge the record on their own against the manager's wishes. Eventually, this record was broken by a foreigner, and Oh was congratulatory. In fact, many foreign players have been embraced by Japanese fans, and as time goes on, it's become more common. Randy Bass himself became a celebrity, becoming so recognizable he got paid $185,000 to shave his beard in a marketing campaign. Brad Leslie became beloved for his insane antics like slicing players after strikeouts, entering the mound on a golf cart, and punching his catcher as hard as possible after getting saves. He was nicknamed the Animal for his psycho behavior and even recorded a hit song in Japan. This led to decades of stardom and a game show career in Japan well after he retired. American players who failed in MLB were becoming stars in Japan, so the perception in the US was that Japanese players were significantly worse than MLB players, which made sense. America had been playing baseball for half a century longer than Japan. The US started sending teams to face Japanese teams in exhibition games in 1908. By 1955, the US teams were 71-1 against the Japanese. In 1971, the Orioles faced what was considered the best Japanese team of all time and beat them 8 times in a row. In 1981, the Royals faced the Japanese All-Star team while having a case of beer in the dugout and still went 9-7-1. The 1984 Orioles claimed that the Japanese host actively tried to take them out after each game and get them drunk so that they would play worse the next day. They still went 8-5-1. After a team of Japanese All-Stars went 1-6 against a team of MLB All-Stars in 1986, a Japanese player said, quote, "We're a group of little leaguers playing adults. We can never challenge the Americans." But however true this was at the time, it was about to change. By 1995, there hadn't been a single Japanese player in MLB in 30 years. This was due to the reserve clause, a policy that had been deemed illegal in American baseball in 1975 was still around in Japan 20 years later. It basically states that when a team drafts a player, that player is property of that team their entire career. There was no free agency, so the only way a player can play for another team was to get traded or released. No MPB team was going to release a player good enough to play in MLB, and a trade with an MLB team was impossible. So the second a player got drafted in Japan, their MLB chances were over. Until Hideo Nomo. He was the best pitcher in Japan and in 1994 hired an agent, which was illegal in MPB. However, this notorious agent, Dom Nomura, discovered a loophole. Nomo wanted out of Japan, but was property of the Buffaloes until he was released, traded, or retired. So in an extremely risky move devised by his agent, he retired at 25 years old. The move essentially prohibited Nomo from pitching in Japan ever again. Instead, he took a pay cut to sign a minor league contract with the Dodgers, a decision that caused so much backlash in Japan. His own father, who said he was embarrassing his former team, stopped talking to his son altogether. At first, Nomo was seen as an enemy for turning his back on Japan. Then, he started pitching. He shocked the world by immediately dominating the league, but what was even more shocking was the media frenzy he created. An insane 15 camera crews showed up to his press conference. Camera crews would follow him into bathrooms. His wife had to stop leaving the house altogether because the media attention was too much. Nomo was a rookie and getting 10 times the attention as anyone on the Dodgers. All of a sudden, he was a hero in Japan. The Dodgers got massive spikes in attendance every time he pitched, sold millions in Nomo merch, and even put a sushi restaurant in Dodger Stadium to adhere to the influx of Japanese fans. When he pitched in the All-Star game, 15 million people in Japan watched. That's twice the number of people who watched the MLB All-Star game this past season, just in Japan alone. Nomo led the league in strikeouts, won Rookie of the Year, finished third in Cy Young voting, and perhaps most importantly, each game he pitched was broadcasted in Japan and watched by millions. MLB realized that Japan not only had players who could dominate, they also had players who could bring the league millions in revenue from the massive Japanese market. A new system was quickly implemented that allowed Japanese players to go to an MLB team as long as that MLB team paid a posting fee to the Japanese team. MLB teams began paying millions to MPB teams for their players, and the MPB teams happily took the massive amounts of money. By 2000, MLB went from having one Japanese player in their 100-year history to having 8 at one time, even having opening day in Japan to take full advantage of the new massive market. Then, the very next year, Ichiro showed up. He was not only Rookie of the Year, he was MVP of the league, was an All-Star, won a Silver Slugger, and a Gold Glove. People were so confident that Japanese hitters could never have success against MLB pitchers. Commentator Rob Dibble said he would wear a G-string thong in Times Square if Ichiro won the batting title. That year, Ichiro also won the batting title, and Rob Dibble had to wear a thong. He not only became the most famous baseball player in the world, he likely became the most famous person in Japan. So famous that his own father created an Ichiro museum next to his childhood home, which displayed a bunch of items he kept from Ichiro's childhood, including Ichiro's retainer. The museum was not only a hit, it still runs and operates today. Ichiro inspired an entire generation of Japanese players, and by 2008, there were 18 Japanese players in MLB. And sometimes their philosophies confused Americans, like when Ichiro reportedly passed up on $22 million worth of endorsements in one season because he thought they were a distraction to his duty of playing baseball. Hideki Matsui got injured during a game while diving for a ball, then apologized to fans for breaking his wrist. And even more perplexing to Americans was when Matsui not only admitted to having a porn collection of over 50,000 movies during a press conference, but also promised to give some of them to the writers. Between Ichiro, Matsui, and Nomo, Japan had MLB stars, but they also had MLB failures, and nobody outside of Japan genuinely believed they had talent that came close to the skill level of America or Latin American countries. But in 2006, they had a chance to prove it, and it almost started a war. The first World Baseball Classic in 2006 is one of the most pivotal moments in Japanese baseball history. On paper, they were extremely outmatched. They had two major league players. Team USA had 30 of them, with a combined 117 All-Star appearances, 6 MVP awards, and 3 Hall of Famers. But their toughest competition ended up being Korea. Centuries of conflict and political turmoil between these two countries almost guaranteed this matchup would get personal, and it did. Ichiro became public enemy number 1 in Korea after previous comments about how he visited the country and said it smelled like garlic, also saying that he wanted to beat Korea so bad they wouldn't have a chance for the next 30 years. When they matched up, Korea instantly sent a message by throwing a fastball directly at him. Korea won the first game, but they played again a few days later in the next round, where once again, Korea upset Japan in what Ichiro described as, quote, the most humiliating loss of his entire life. After the game, Korea celebrated by planting a Korean flag on the mound as Ichiro looked on in complete and utter rage. Team Japan saw this as the ultimate sign of disrespect and got a chance at revenge again in the semifinal. Ichiro was booed relentlessly by Korean fans. Later, the Korean third baseman caught a pop-up and tossed it towards Ichiro's feet. And pitcher Kim Byung-hun even nailed a Japanese batter after they hit a homer off him. Japan ended up getting their revenge. They beat Korea, went to the final, and defeated Cuba to win the first ever WBC. This final game was watched by 60 million people in Japan alone. That's more than any World Series in history, likely making it the most watched baseball game of all time, as well as perhaps the most watched sporting event in Japanese history. It was a cultural event and a legendary team. If you search the 2006 WBC in Japanese, you will see clips of this team with millions and millions of views. If you search it in English, you're gonna find basically nothing. In America, this tournament is completely forgotten. Despite the stacked roster, they finished 7th, and most people dismissed it as an exhibition that by no means proved Japanese baseball was anywhere close to American baseball. A team with basically no major league talent winning the tournament felt like a fluke, but 3 years later, they won it again, this time beating the United States head-to-head and once again reaching viewership numbers that no baseball game in America could come close to. These players were unknown to the rest of the world and stuck in MPB, but many of them would go on to come to America and have amazing MLB careers. On top of that, at the youth level, Japan also excelled in Little League, going on to win 4 of the next 7 World Series. But despite dominating international competition, Japan's reputation still lagged behind the United States, the Dominican Republic, and perhaps even several other Latin American countries. In 2017, there were only 8 Japanese players in MLB. This gave Americans the impression that there were only 8 Japanese players good enough to play in MLB. In reality, there were dozens. And this is why. Unlike countries in Latin America, Taiwan, and even Korea, many Japanese players can actually make more money in Japan where they are stars. In fact, NPB is the second highest attended sports league in the world. In 2019, NPB surpassed MLB in average attendance per game. They have 15 less teams and 400 less games a year than NBA, yet draw 5 million more fans than NBA does every single season. To put into context how massive baseball has become in Japan, this past season, 32 million people watched Game 7 of the Japan series. That's more than the average 2023 World Series game, NBA Finals game, and Stanley Cup Finals game combined. The league is so popular and important in Japan that players grow up dreaming of NPB success. Many have no desire to play in MLB at all. Ichiro's stardom and success in America had inspired an influx of Japanese talent in the 2000s, but by the late 2010s, the number of Japanese players dwindled. The ones in MLB weren't coming close to the production and star power of Ichiro. Japan was likely better at baseball than ever, but with their talent staying in NPB, there was no way for them to prove it against the best competition in the world. Then, Shohei showed up. In Japan, Ohtani voluntarily lived in the team dormitory even while being the most famous athlete in the country. Despite making $2.4 million a year, he gave his mother complete control of his finances and lived off an allowance of $1,000 a month. In the dorms, his rent and food were covered by the team, and all his free time was taken by baseball training. So during this time, Ohtani spent $4,000 over a span of 2 entire years. He cared so little about money, he gave up a potential contract worth over $200 million to come to MLB in 2017, where he signed for $3.5 million, meaning he gave up $196 million just to come to MLB 2 years sooner. Ohtani didn't even get a driver's license until he was in his mid-20s and a national hero. The rabid Japanese paparazzi has been trying to catch him with a girlfriend for years and have still yet to do so. And when he did a 10 things he couldn't live without video for GQ, they were literally all baseball or training items. Ohtani's obsessive and borderline unhealthy devotion to baseball is the epitome of Japanese baseball training philosophy. And Ohtani quickly becoming arguably the greatest player ever proves this philosophy is extremely helpful. By 2023, the world knew the greatest and most famous player on earth was Japanese. What the world didn't know was that several other of the world's best players were also Japanese, but nobody outside of Japan had ever heard of them. But in the 2023 WBC, they had a chance to change that. With stars like Ohtani, legends like Yu Darvish, and up-and-coming phenoms like Roki Sasaki all on the same team, this was heralded as potentially the greatest team ever assembled in Japan. But with only 3 players with any MLB experience, the rest of the world heralded Team USA and the Dominican Republic as significantly stronger. In Japan, this quickly became the most popular team of all time, with so much hype surrounding them that 36 million people watched their exhibition game. Each game during pool play was watched by at least 40% of the entire country. Their game against Korea was watched by 55 million people in Japan, and their final game in Japan was watched by over 60 million people, once again breaking the record for the most watched baseball game of all time. Then, in a matchup to win it all, they defeated the United States for another WBC title. The magnitude of this tournament was so big in Japan, and economists estimated that the 3-week-long tournament generated $484 million for the Japanese economy. The sheer numbers in viewership makes it hard to deny that right now, baseball is significantly more popular in Japan than it is in America. Not only did they beat America in a head-to-head matchup, they marched through the entire tournament going undefeated. Japan has been overlooked due to their lack of representation in the majors for decades, but now, more than ever, that is changing. Shohei Ohtani's insane star power is having the exact same effect Ichiro had on Japanese players in the 2000s. The amount of Japanese players in MLB has already increased by 66% in the past 2 seasons. This offseason, Ohtani signed the biggest contract in history. A few weeks later, his Japanese teammate Yoshinobu Yamamoto signed the biggest pitching contract in baseball history. The highest paid hitter and pitcher ever are now both Japanese. Kodai Senga made the switch to MLB and dominated the National League last year. 2 other pitchers from Team Japan also signed contracts with MLB teams this offseason, and more are coming. Roki Sasaki threw a perfect game while striking out 19 batters. If that happened in MLB, it'd be considered the most dominant performance in history. He followed it with 8 more perfect innings the next game before getting pulled. He did this at 20 years old. Sasaki has already requested to be posted and will likely come to MLB next season. Munetaki Murakami, who sent Team Japan to the WBC final with a walk-off double, broke the single-season home run record in Japan at 22 years old. He also made his intentions to come to MLB clear and will likely come within the next 2 years. Even Japan's top high school prospect, Rentaro Sasaki, who hit a mind-blowing 140 home runs in high school, is enrolling in an American university in order to get to MLB sooner, likely becoming the first top Japanese high school prospect to skip MPB altogether. For the first time, maybe ever, MLB has become the end goal for players in Japan. Not only are more players coming to MLB, the best players in the country are doing it. In a few years, there will be more Japanese players in MLB than ever, and these players will have a chance to prove to everyone that once and for all, Japan has become the best baseball country in the world.